Thank you to Pogon and the Goethe Institute for inviting me. In 2012, Leipzig was the home base to 6 artist residency programs: Blumen, Fugitive, Leah, One-Sided Story, Pilotenkusha, and the studio program of Halleferzen. Sadly today, only Leah, studio program, and Fugitive are still active. This presentation, as an informal study, will begin to examine the fragility of each structure, both internally and in relation to the wider local and international community, its relevance to its district and social impact, and its inclusion in Leipzig's reurbanization prospectus. I will touch upon Leipzig's history since 1989, its rapid decline and more recent rejuvenation that has led to the current climate. I will then briefly introduce the Leipzig Charter and Integrated City Development concept, also known as SECO 2020. By necessity, I must raise the subject of the media frenzy surrounding Leipzig, rather Leipzig, and its impact on real estate speculation, private foreign investment, and the burgeoning supply caught and inevitable bubble market that could easily follow. I will then cite how artists and art organizations are consequently vulnerable in such a system, both the forerunners and victims inherent to the gentrification process. There are a number of possible solutions to prevent displacement, and I will name a few avenues. My hope is that this discussion could be a starting point to reassemble, fortify, and expand an association in Leipzig between non-profit initiatives that have been left out of the equation of development. I believe we must come together, educate ourselves, and take control of our circumstances through forming an artist lobby. Collective momentum can affect change and strengthen our capacities for necessary programmatic restructuring, both institutional and individual economic growth, and political presence. I believe an exhaustive, transparent survey of the actual situation of artists in Leipzig, both foreign and of German nationality, bringing forth concrete evidence and statistics before our governance, could motivate them to rethink legislation and cultural spending, to change their perspective and include artists as an essential and contributing demographic that must be protected, not only exploited as the selling point. We must awaken them to the mischaracterization of artists being acceptable casualties of the advancement of our European creative cities. Surveying both those that have closed and those that still struggle to remain open and vital, the information gathered here came directly from interviews with programs. In order to identify the factors that make up the precarious environment that they find themselves in, we met as a group as well as separately to candidly assess their financial health and sustainability, discussing why they were or are undercapitalized, understaffed, lacking in adequate facilities or the necessary budget to refurbish, repair, or even properly heat their spaces. We discussed their lack of autonomy due to lack of, We discussed their lack of autonomy due to lack of property ownership, how their local and state government funding decreased while their rents dramatically and unpredictably increased by rates of 5% annually or even 36% in a single year, without any recourse to appeal the rent hikes. With these increases in their expenditures and momentous drops in their funding, some of the projects capsized or feebly accepted the new conditions of their contracts, destabilizing them in the moment they sought growth. In 2011, an informal association formed, initially with the sole objective of building a strategy to create more web presence for each of their projects. To improve visibility, United Residencies launched a mutual website in which each of their projects was described, providing links, announcements, and a directory of practical information about life in Leipzig. As the founder and director of the one-year project, One-Sided Story, established in January 2012, I was the last member to join the association in April of that same year. On a monthly basis, we met to broaden our perspective of one another, as well as our own profile, troubleshoot survival strategies, exchange tips on dealing with unruly artists, and on a few occasions made excursions to visit residencies in other cities for informational interviews. In 2012, United Residencies produced one single project together as an association, in partnership with Academy Schloss Solitude in our backyards. Since the artist network is quite centralized in Leipzig, mainly concentrated in the neighborhoods Plagwitz and Lindenau in the western districts, there was a lot of crossover between projects. Bartering was a resourceful strategy for the overextended directors. Many of our residents lived together. We shared technical equipment, Staff even traversed multiple programs at an administrative level or for hire. We shared information handbooks, even contract templates, vendor contacts, partnered in projects involving workshops, publications, exhibitions, and short-term residencies in other cities, invited each other's residents on gallery, museum, and city tours, organized barbecues, and on a couple of occasions even trips outside of Leipzig. The association worked well, despite not having a defined mission. What derailed United Residencies, causing it to go into hibernation, could be seen as an entrance point into discussing the overall infrastructure of each project, identifying their indicators of vulnerability, their adaptability, relevance, and durability. The residencies were mainly all grassroots projects or new branches of larger nonprofit art institutions, existing between 1 and 8 years. Collectively, they brought over 400 international artists to our city, with only 5% immigrants, which is natural to Leipzig. Many of them relocated permanently to Leipzig. They ranged in staff size from 1 to 10 employees. All projects were additionally dependent on volunteers, practicum, interns, or bartering partners. Only 2 of the residencies, LIA and the studio program, are operated by salaried employees. In both cases, only 1 full-time employee dedicated to the residency program. For the others, they worked for years paid only by fringe benefits. LIA, Pilotenkusha, One-Sided Story, and Blumen each had rental agreements that range from 1 to 5 years. The studio program of Hallefertzen has a rather unusual situation in which it does not own nor rent their building. Their primary funder, the Federkai Foundation, established by Carsten Schmitz in order to initiate Hallefertzen, the nonprofit, is also an owner of the Spinnerei, who in turn owns the building Hallefertzen. Through a written agreement, they are permitted to run their programs within the building, and in exchange are responsible for the maintenance and renovation of the 20,000 square meter space, which is quite burdensome on their budget. After a successful relationship for 15 years, they are currently renegotiating this agreement, and the results could be an existential question for Hallefertzen. The situation is positive, however, a fragile point in their structure. The residential building where Fugitive was founded is owned by its director and a silent partner. Their operation of their programming was and is contingent on the staff of Fugitive renovating and maintaining this building, and the agreement with the silent partner will also soon need to be renegotiated. Each of the residencies have or had different official status as well. LIA operated as a GmbH, Hallefertzen, Fugitive, and Blumen as non-profit vereins, and Pilotenkusha and One-Sided Story without status, operating as personal projects. All of the residencies, despite grants from cultural institutions and ministries, private donations and memberships, or with foundations behind them, were all hindered by the inflexibility of their budgets, since many of them had project-based rather than institutional supportive funding, therefore earmarked for specific purposes. The lack of city and state grants for art organizations to get off the ground put some of the founders in compromising situations where they were required to self-finance their startup in order to begin, which was and is true for the majority of offsite spaces in Plagwitz and Lindenau, the arts districts. As operational costs increased through the years, naturally so did the need for unrestricted funding from multiple sources, for which residencies is a difficult model to find funding for. Several of the residencies complained of funding caps. They could easily receive €2,500 per year from the city, but not more, and not more for years. Only one of the structures managed over time to receive institutional grants of €18,000 annually, however only after 10 years of applying. For the younger residencies that were working off of sweat equity, this was a major point of frustration. The residency participation fees, whether they charged €250 or €1,100 per month per artist, represented a significant imbalance of percentage within their total earned income. Though they all sought to shift towards alternative generators, all desirous to become stipends, this disproportion signals that they are or were stuck in the startup phase even years into their projects. Many of the projects were forced to plan month to month rather than year to year. Even the residencies whose budgets were offset by grants or corporate sponsorship admitted that these contributions were inconsequential in the grand scheme of their overall budget and mostly served to create an outward appearance of stability. Coining the phrase of Ted Berger from the John Mitchell Foundation, Leipzig residencies have always been subsidized by passion. The energy and devotion of its founders was often the keystone to their organization's long-standing. Their enthusiasm often bridged the years of empty pockets until they were able to secure reliable funding body to help them grow. Burnout rates ran high, and founder syndrome was the norm. In one case, the changing of the German university system to a more American system through the Bologna process actually had a harmful effect on their intern pool. They largely depended on art history students that wanted to gain practical experience from working directly with international artists. With the new point system, the students no longer had the time to be involved in programs outside of their university. A similar situation existed where the organization had benefited from a government unemployment program, RBM, Arbeitsbeschaffungsmaßnahme. The RBM would send often highly skilled and educated unemployed to the nonprofit to work as interns, which was of great value for both parties. The RBM program has since been discontinued. The range of problems were as varied as the projects themselves, and not dissimilar to the challenges that many art organizations and nonprofits in general face. Few funding sources, insufficient manpower, hindering ties to their foundations or single funders, restrictions from landlords and insecurity in commercial rental agreements, intolerance rather than supportive interest by the city were among the contributing factors that closed some of these projects, despite their importance to the community, both international and local. As One-Sided Story was a one-year project, though I struggled with many of the same problems, my situation was designed to be finite. The United Residency Network for me was a strong introduction to Leipzig and alternative solutions, which I carry over into my new work as art director of the new cultural center Kunstkraftwerk. As the art sector in Leipzig is at a crucial transitional juncture, I will now briefly sketch the greater plan for Leipzig. In the words of Dominic Kraus, who is working with Alexander Dietze to convert a former department store in Lindenau into a new cultural complex, stated, "There is a discrepancy between the city as it is and the city you see in the media." Leipzig today cannot be discussed without putting it into the context of how the collapse of the GDR in 1989 affected the population and economy of the city, from which Leipzig is still feeling the aftershock. The mass exodus of 150,000 of its inhabitants in a 10-year period after the reunification of Germany was due to a wide-sweeping flight to the west and drastic suburbanization. Staggering unemployment as high as 19% in only 4 years and the loss of 90% of all jobs in the manufacturing industry were contributing triggers. Vacancy skyrocketed to 22% in the year 2000, leaving some neighborhoods nearly empty, compromising the city's functionality. This radical shift led to the adoption of a number of West German redevelopment models in the pursuit to stimulate the market, to strengthen underprivileged areas, and to rehabilitate old buildings. Vector House, moderated by Haushalten e.V., is one of the successful models adopted by Leipzig. It functioned as an agreement between a community of users and the property owner, typically for periods of 5 to 10 years. The users take responsibility for the operating costs and refurbishment of the property, in most cases in lieu of paying rent. Unfortunately, in the current market in Leipzig, which is characterized by a flood of investments in housing construction, such projects as Vector houses are in jeopardy since the owners are allowed to sell the property at any time, evicting the community that sustained it during hard times. Such expansive development in the face of the still high vacancy rate of 12%, with 30,000 apartments still unoccupied, is a cookie-cutter situation for a bubble. In the meantime, the art community is steamrolled by the sudden interest in Plagwitz. In 2007, the Leipzig Charter on Sustainable European Cities was written and adopted by the EU. The Charter is rich with inclusive statutes. It specifies the model of the 21st century European city and the values it should represent. Resident-friendly with an interdisciplinary planning approach, the Charter is designed to fight social marginalization. The integrated urban development concept Leipzig 2020 reflects these values on paper, however not entirely in practice. The plan calls for the construction or conversion of buildings for mixed use, boasts social integration when it actually widens class differences. determines the use of public spaces, ensures climate protection, and addresses education needs. The heart of SECO is civic participation. However, in my research, I was hard-pressed to find a single nonprofit art organization that has been approached by the city for their input. In defense of SECO, the arts sector also has not approached them. The concept of SECO is a joint venture, partly determined by the public authorities and partly by its citizens. So there should be nothing stopping the art sector in Leipzig from demanding representation in the blueprint, especially since Plagwitz has been identified by SECO as one of the 5 disadvantaged districts. As the majority of artists are in the lower income bracket or on hard sphere, state support, they are particularly at risk. The situation in Leipzig happens all over the world. In New York City, where I'm from, it's a generally accepted consequence of progress. However, there are those that have successfully fought against this inevitability. The 200 evicted artists of Industry City in Brooklyn mobilized and are calling for the city to expand the 80-20 rule to include commercial spaces. The 80-20 program is a government program granting developers tax-exempt financing to construct multifamily rental developments, provided that they offer at least 20% of the units to low-income tenants earning less than 50% of the area median income. In addition, the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development is now taking lottery entrants for new affordable artist housing, Art Space PS 109 in East Harlem. In Berlin, Ex-Rota Print, a former factory complex in Wedding, proved that artists can secure their space for long-term usage in an owner-equivalent agreement for the price of €1 for 99 years, having fought for an air pact. When their complex went up for auction, they were ready and made a convincing argument to the city representatives that their contribution to society was essential and that they should be protected from private investment speculation. When they hit a roadblock, finding out that their complex was part of a 45-property super pact that an Icelandic investor was purchasing from the city at auction, sight unseen, they persevered. Succinctly arguing why their space should be removed from the packet, they wrote to every council member and parliament representative, met with the Icelandic investor, and found partners in the BBK, Stiftung Trias, Stiftung Edith Marion, Co-Opera Sammelstiftung. They were victorious through their own ingenuity. The same could happen in Leipzig through creative solutions. Thank you.